everybody. It's Lauren Dockett with Psychotherapy Networker, and you are joining us on Facebook Live at Symposium 2019. It is Saturday afternoon, and I am thrilled to have with me Suzanne Iasenza. Suzanne, thanks for taking the time.
Happy to.
Suzanne is a sex therapist and a psychotherapist who works up in Manhattan, and she teaches at the Ackerman Institute and the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, also in New York City. And she has a book coming out from Routledge called Transforming Sexual Narratives, which will add to her other 2 books she's already got under her belt. And she has been doing some really innovative, interesting stuff in the field. So there are sex therapists out there, there are psychotherapists out there, there are psychotherapists who want to do a little bit more in the area of the sex therapy. They're still not sure quite what they're doing. So I always love to have these conversations with people who do both so they can really educate our audience. You have a 3-part process of working with couples that helps them free themselves from rigid ideas of what sex should be so they can explore what really brings them pleasure. So let's take a little bit of time and you take us through that process.
Okay, basically, I think of it as a narrative frame in general. The overall umbrella is a narrative frame, meaning whatever beliefs we have are stories we tell ourselves. So part of what I'm interested in is where do those stories come from? And most people, when they come in with a sexual problem, don't even know that stories are fueling with their shutdowns or their anxieties or aversions or whatever is going on. So a large part of my work is helping people identify the narratives and even to start to transform them or challenge them. And there are many different sources of these narratives. So probably because I'm trained in psychoanalytic work as well as couples therapy and sex therapy, a little bit of a mutt in that way, I take those forms of thinking and bring them to the patients to be curious about what sources bring these narratives to life for them, usually in not a good way. So one big one, let's say, could be your family of origin, right? So I spend a fair amount of time doing in-depth sexual histories with patients. So with a couple, for instance, I do those separately, not together.
Okay.
So people really have the privacy and the freedom to just unfold their sexual story with me without necessarily consciously or unconsciously censoring themselves because their partner's there. And so I start these histories with what's your very earliest memory of sexuality, as far back as people can remember.
Okay.
And then unfold it through childhood, adolescence, first couple experiences perhaps, all the relationships they've had prior to this present relationship, and then how they unfold their story of how sexuality occurred in this present relationship. So by the time we're finished with it, could be 3, 4, 5 individual sessions for each partner,
Okay.
Which is a lot of time. That people then, we come back after all that time and start to be very curious about how each person's sets of sexual narratives are actually being kind of working together to co-create the sexual problem or to co-maintain it. And then what parts of those narratives need to be transformed and what new kinds of narratives need to be created for people, almost to like Michael White might say, the family therapist, narrative family therapist, to re-author a sexual life, both individually and together. So it's a slower process than general sex therapy might be, which may focus more behaviorally on the issues. But I often find with the more complex problems people come in with now, the number one problem people come in with now are desire issues.
Right.
They either, it could be the discrepant desire couple where one wants more sex than the other. It could be the low desire or no sex couple where both say we haven't had sex in years. And that's often the most common presenting problem in sex therapy. And those kinds of issues usually are multi-layered, could have actually unconscious as well as conscious sources of problems. So.
And this has got to be novel for them. They
Very
probably never
novel.
looked back beyond their first sexual experiences as adults or teens,
Totally.
right? To really go.
Even the whole idea of a sexual history for most people, like, really?
What's
a
that?
sexual history?
Yeah,
If they've been to therapy before, they had a regular history, right? You know, telling
Right.
your mom, your dad, whatever.
Right.
And this really starts with what's your first memory of sexuality, which is an interesting starting point to then start to weave, and kind of unpack how they develop to who they are now.
Fascinating.
Right.
So then you say you also have this goal, and one of your goals is to help couples ultimately be a strong, erotic team. So once they've gone through this process with you,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know when they've made it to the point that they're a strong erotic team? Yeah.
All right. Well, probably one of the first things I think is instead of doing sex, they are being when they're sexual. So it is a bit of a kind of Buddhist or meditative idea, but that really is what helps people be most alive is when they're in the present moment. Whether we're in life or we're in sex, being in the present moment is where aliveness happens, where spontaneity can happen, where creativity can happen. So if people are kind of being in sex rather than doing sex, moving away from the performance-oriented models we have, like, you have to have desire, arousal, and then orgasm, and they move from that type of model to some of the later sexual models that are out there that probably most people don't know about, but that begin or end with other things, like willingness, beginning with willingness, ending with pleasure, or beginning with willingness and ending with connection. Those are other models for sexual health that hardly anyone knows about, including therapists, by the way. And those are other sources of narratives that hopefully get changed in the process of the work so that a couple who's ready to graduate, so to speak, from sex therapy would be in the being of sex more than the doing, less performance-oriented.
Both on board together.
Both on board together.
Right.
Both moving from judgment of self or other to more curiosity. So no matter what's emerging, you're more curious about it than judgmental. And finally, I make sometimes a joke with patients. You know what? You'll be ready to graduate when you can do good, bad sex. And they'll laugh about that. And I'll say, what I mean by good, bad sex is no matter what happens that you might have thought was bad or might feel uncomfortable or whatever, that you have plan B and C and that you always leave connected. That it doesn't matter what happens when you're sexual tonight. That if you can leave connected and feeling good about yourself and each other, that's what good sex is. And then people have those skills to really move through and kind of surfboard through a sexual experience. So no matter what happens, the body doesn't act the way it should, or you think it should, right? Or the arousal doesn't happen, or the whatever doesn't happen that they think should, that they can stay together and have fun and just let it be.
Fantastic.
That's what I think I would say is a good erotic team.
It's a revelatory way of thinking about it. Thanks so much, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody. That's it for Facebook Live. Take care. Hi, everybody. We just couldn't get enough of Suzanne Iasenza, so we are back for a few more minutes. And one thing I wanted to talk to Suzanne about is this really interesting way she has to talk about what's happening in sex therapy these days and this difference she sees between relational versus traditional behavioral sex therapy. And I think a lot of sex therapists think sex therapy is sex therapy, and that means behavioral.
Yes.
So let's hear from you about what this difference is and why it might be important.
And the behavioral, perspective came from our forefather and mother of sex therapy, which was Masters and Johnson. All right. They invented sex therapy. It was based on a lot of research and books and really revolutionized or began the field. And but it was focused on with a behavioral emphasis, which is basically if you could help people be in the body more than the mind, that's not necessarily an unhelpful idea. And then if people can begin with sensate focus, they invented that, which is the progressive touch.
Right.
That sexuality can come online. So that since the 60s when they developed this, that's been what sex therapy's been about, kind of in this silo over here of sex therapists who really didn't think much about all the other variables that affect sexuality, right? Like childhood, trauma possibly, attachment, the quality of the relationship the person's in now, health issues, gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, all these other variables. So they weren't thinking in that way. It was more of a medical-based model and a behavior-based model. Nothing wrong with that. And those parts still are valuable now. So I wouldn't say everyone should just be relational either and not take into consideration behavioral change and also medical and other kinds of factors. But a relational perspective brings in a lot more, especially a more psychoanalytic relational even. And Helen Singer Kaplan in the 80s was one of the first people to bring that change along because she was trained in psychoanalytic tradition and then in sex therapy. And so her book, The New Sex Therapy in the 80s, was a major paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Not that all sex therapists actually follow that way of working,
Yeah.
but she did begin to say there are unconscious things that go on too. There are couple dynamics that go on too
Yeah.
that can affect sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't all just be done with behavioral techniques.
Mm-hmm.
She would often say, well, you can start with the behavioral techniques, that's great. But if after whatever number of months things aren't changing, you've got to have more tools in the toolbox.
Right.
And that might mean understanding unconscious dynamics, family issues, couple communication patterns, anything else.
But do you get any pushback from clients? Are they expecting to go in and have more behavioral fixes rather than start to have to go into relational issues?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, just like with almost general psychotherapy patients
right,
too, right?
right.
Some people come in and they really do like the silver bullet idea.
Yeah.
Like, do you have something just to, that's why psychopharmacology also, there's this tension in the field. How much do you use medication? How much do you use talk therapy? A lot of studies show that both can be very helpful depending on the presenting problem. But so most of the time, one way isn't the only way. But for some people, shorter term behavioral really is the best way.
Okay.
Just most of the folks that come in now with, let's say, desire issues, that's something that isn't easily cured with, let's say a pill or a set of behavioral instructions per se. Especially, let's say, if when you unpack that desire issue, let's say someone was a trauma survivor in childhood, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or it could be neglect, or it could be the intergenerational transmission of trauma that then unconsciously gets passed on, that the person now is dealing with, that was actually a trauma their mother went through or their grandfather went through. So there are all these other layers that if not unpacked or at least explored or raised as a possibility, could make some behaviorally focused sex therapy treatments feel like stuck.
Yes.
They don't know where to go after they've done many weeks of sensate focus, or they've given different homework assignments, improved communication, that things aren't moving.
And is it all kinds of clients, or is it clients who are in long-term relationships, or is it clients who can't manage to keep going with their sexuality, whatever relationship they're in? Is it a mix of clients who you can work with in this way?
Yes, okay. I work with individuals and couples in this way. I also work with people who come in with more physically based problems like premature ejaculation or painful intercourse, and then people who might come in with more of the relationally oriented presenting problems like desire issues, or they could be fighting about sex, like sexual preferences are different. Yeah. What do you do with that?
Right.
Especially if you want to be monogamous, right?
Yeah.
Or there could be people who are coming in who are talking about, do we want to be monogamous?
Yeah.
Do I want to open the relationship? Do I want to be polyamorous? There's so many different things now that people are dealing with. Or sexual orientation or gender fluidity, so that people either know or don't know at the beginning of a relationship, that then could be actually a source of a sexual problem that really isn't a sexual problem per se. It could be an identity issue. It could be differences in preferences issue. So there's a lot to unpack.
Right, and that takes time.
It takes time. That's why I think, to give like 3 or 4 or 5, whatever number of sessions to individuals, it almost seems like, why not?
Right.
Because if you just treat, the wound that's showing, that people say exists, and there are other things under it, even if it does work for a while, it may not have lasting power.
Okay.
So I always think, why not start in the beginning with a much more bigger. But I tell patients this in the first session. I'll usually say, this is the way I work. Yeah. So that it's almost like informed consent.
Right,
And I might say, you know what, I might not be the right one to work with you, because I would not necessarily want to move right to touching exercises in a second session.
Okay.
I would feel uncomfortable doing that, frankly, not knowing, how do I know one of these folks is not a trauma survivor and might not even know about it.
Right.
Than to move to touching, let's say, in a second session, before I know anything about their history, just for me personally, doesn't feel comfortable.
Absolutely, that's a really valid point.
Right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Suzanne,
You're
for
welcome.
taking the extra time.
You're welcome. I was happy to do it.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.